isn't that great? That's a new one for me. I haven't heard that before. That's the Erev Shabbos Nigun. So a wordless melody. This one is called the Erev Shabbos Nigun, which is what we're in right now. Erev Shabbos, the time before Shabbos began, the day before Shabbos began last night. We're in it right now. Shabbos begins tonight, and that was by Joey Newcomb. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us as we do a little learning on Erev Shabbos? James Roth in Indianapolis, Yehudit Sobel says, Shabbat Shalom, wishing Nina Salin all a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos. Amen. Stephen in Dover, Chaim in Charlotte, Pauline in Arkansas, Nancy in North Carolina, Lucy in Foggy, Minnesota, Loretta in Roseburg, Oregon, Carlos, wishing everybody a good afternoon. Pam Simmons, good Shabbos, a welcome and restful Sabbath to all, sending love from Nashville. Guy says happy Friday. David Rupa is saying Shabbat Shalom from Notre what? From Notre Dame in Indiana. And Sueli Sue says Shabbat Shalom. Over there on the YouTube side, Sheila in Montana, Neil in Virginia, Lynn in Texas. Welcome, everybody. Great to be with you. Couple of dedications. Yona Shine is dedicating today's learning in honor of Moshe and Simcha Storch. Moshe Storch is our musical director. We haven't been able to do so much live in-person music like we normally do. Please God, everybody gets vaccinated soon. The pandemic is in our rearview mirror, and we can get back to some of our regular musical programming. We've got some big plans, some big ideas for a project we're going to do with Moshe. So, Yona Shine, thank you so much for your dedication. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. May Moshe and Simcha Storch and the new baby boy they had this year and their daughter Ella Menucha, may all of them be blessed as well. And we say together, Amen. Another dedication from David Rosenberg in Suffern, New York. Dedicating today's learning as a remembrance of the soul of Rabbi Yosef Tzvi ben Rabbi Yisroel. May his neshama have a great aliyah. May his soul have a great elevation in the world of souls. May his memory always be for a blessing. And we say amen. And David, may you and your family be showered in blessings. And we say amen. All right. Where are we holding? We are in chapter 3 of Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We're on Daf Mem Ches, page 48. And here in chapter 3, we're completing our discussion of the 4th Mishnah and opening and completing our discussion of some short Mishnahs, numbers 5 and 6 of this chapter 3. You'll recall that yesterday we were in the midst of the epic debate between Rabbah and Rav Hisda with respect to this principle, this concept of hoil, since. In other words, some will say that a particular transgression will not apply in a given situation if, hypothetically, the person to whom the transgression would be applied actually has an out, right? There's a hypothetical escape clause, as it were. The classic example of that is somebody who cooks on Yom Tov, on a festival, thinking, or just making more food than he really needs for Yom Tov, thinking he'll eat it after Yom Tov, after the festival. So that's a prohibition. Yom Tov, festivals, holidays, Jewish holidays have the same rules as Shabbos. No labor permitted of the 39 categories of labor, which the sages define. What is a prohibited labor on Shabbos? It's the 39 types of labor that were required to build the tabernacle when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness. The difference between holidays and Shabbos is that on holidays, it is permitted to do the labors involved in cooking, right? So you can cook a meal on Yom Tov. You can't do that on Shabbos. However, this exception, this permit to cook on Yom Tov only applies if you're cooking for Yom Tov, for the needs of Yom Tov, for the needs of the holiday meal. So if you're cooking on a holiday and planning to eat it after the holiday, you would have violated that transgression. Says Rabbah, the person is not going to be liable to lashes, the punishment for that transgression, because even if he cooks on a holiday to eat after the holiday. Why? Since Hoyle, we can say that guests might have dropped in unexpectedly, and then he would need all that food that was going to be eaten later, but now it will be eaten on the holiday. So that's the out clause, and therefore the person is not flogged. Rav Hisda disagrees with Rabbah and says, we don't say Hoyle, we don't say since, we don't use this escape clause. And if a person cooks on Yom Tov on the holiday for planning to eat it after the holiday, he would be liable to lashes for that transgression. That's the debate that we opened yesterday. And then Abaye challenged Rabbah, and Rabbah says, we do hold by this principle of Hoyle, of since. Abaye says, no, we don't. We don't hold by that. The sages, the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnaic period, did not hold by that. And how do we know? Because we have this case, this teaching in a Brisa, that a person, if he cooks and eats this meal, of the sciatic nerve of a cow cooked in milk on a holiday, and eats it, so this cooking and eating results in 5 transgressions. Why? Because he was unnecessarily cooking on a festival. Since this is a prohibited food, the sciatic nerve is prohibited to Jews, and cooking meat and milk together is prohibited for Jews. So this is unnecessary cooking, since he's cooking something that's prohibited anyway. So he would be guilty of violating unnecessary cooking on a festival, cooking milk and meat together, eating the product of meat and milk cooked together, eating the sciatic nerve of a cow, which is prohibited to Jews, and kindling an unnecessary fire. That's 5 transgressions from this single act of cooking and eating the sciatic nerve on a festival cooked in milk. Says Abaye, if the Tanaim, if the sages of the Mishnah held by this principle of Hoyle, of since, then there wouldn't be 5 transgressions, there would only be 4. Since we could say that this fire that he kindled in order to cook this prohibited mixture, he might come to use that fire for something that's permitted. Since we could say that fire will be used for something that's permitted, there should only be 4 transgressions, not 5. Since in fact there are 5 transgressions, it must be that we don't hold by the principle of Hoyle. So then Rabbah answered Abaye and says, well, your proof is not a proof, because we could just as well say, let's remove kindling as one of the prohibitions, and there's still 5 prohibitions. If, for example, the wood that he uses for this fire was muktzah, it was wood that was set aside. They weren't planning to use that wood for a fire on the festival. It wasn't prepared for use on the festival. And if he makes use of that wood that wasn't, planned to be used on the festival, he would violate the principle of muktzah. And so then we're back to 5 prohibitions. The Gemara, or Abaye, will answer, and is muktzah biblical? Is that a biblical prohibition? We've learned that it's a rabbinic prohibition. If it's a rabbinic prohibition, he's guilty of violating a rabbinic prohibition, but it's not 5 Torah prohibitions like you've been telling me that would lead to somebody getting lashes. But Rabbah will answer, well, yes, muktzah is a biblical prohibition. We learned that out from the manna in the desert. And when God through his servant Moses told us that we would be eating the manna while we're wandering in the desert. Along with that command came this idea that you will prepare for Shabbos. right? What was the, hold on a second. The, and is it Matzah? Yes, in Exodus 16:5, and it shall come to pass on the 6th day that they shall prepare that which they bring in, meaning what they're going to use on Shabbos is what they prepare to use on Shabbos, and if it's not prepared, it's set aside, it's Matzah. And the negative commandment on that is you shall not perform any labor. So that's kind of a general catch-all, but if you use this set-aside stuff, then there would be a biblical prohibition, and Matzah is a biblical prohibition, according to Rabbah, at least within this debate. So then Abaye says, well, okay, then I have a different challenge for you. Abaye says, you, Rabbah, said to me that unlike Shabbos, whether one that holidays, Yom Tovim, right? That holidays are different than Shabbos in the sense that if on Shabbos you violate, let's say, 2 different categories of labor. Let's say that you forgot that it was Shabbos, and you cut a plant that was growing in the ground. So that's the prohibited labor on Shabbos of harvesting. If you detach some plant that was growing from the ground, and then let's say you lit a fire, or you kindled a light again because you forgot it was Shabbos. So that's 2 definitely different categories, harvesting and kindling. And if you did both of those on one Shabbos, so then you would be liable to bring 2 sin offerings for having violated on the same Shabbos 2 different categories, 2 of the 39 prohibited categories of labor. However, on a festival, both of those things, right, kindling an unnecessary fire, not for cooking, and cutting something from the ground, those would be 2 different labors, 2 different categories of labor. But if you did both of those on a holiday, on a festival, because you forgot that it was the festival day, you would only be liable to bring 1 sin offering because they all get covered by 1 sin offering on festivals, whereas on Shabbos, you'd be liable to bring 2 different sin offerings. So that's an added stringency of Shabbos over holidays. Right, so says Abaye that if you're now claiming that there's Matzah, is one of those 5 transgressions in this case of of cooking the sciatic nerve in milk on a holiday, and unnecessary cooking. So that's 2 violations with respect to the holiday. You should only be liable for 1 sin offering, not 2 separate ones. The other ones, cooking meat and milk, eating the product of meat and milk, and eating the sciatic nerve, those are not holiday related. So those would still stand, but cooking an unnecessary meal, cooking a prohibited meal on a holiday, and using Matzah, wood, to cook that meal, those would both be related to the holiday and would not be separate transgressions, at least in terms of bringing a sin offering. So rather, what we should do, and who is the sage that brings this this alternative idea? It's unclear. Hold on a second. So who says rather? Rather, I guess it's Abaye, or maybe it's Rabbah. It doesn't say whether Rabbah is now answering Abaye or Abaye is making his own suggestion. But either way, where am I? Rather, substitute, instead of calling it Matzah wood that was not be prepared to use on a holiday, instead substitute the wood of an Asherah. Right? So what's an Asherah? An Asherah is a tree that was used for idolatry. Right? So there were other people who lived in the Holy Land before the Jews did, before we entered 3,000 years ago. And these Canaanite people were often idolaters, and one of their gods that they worshipped was a tree. I don't know if the tree represented the god or they thought the tree was the god, but it was some kind of idolatrous practice where they danced around and brought sacrifices to a tree. So we know that idolatry is something that God really hates. It's one of the major sins. Right? They're up on a level with murder and forbidden sexual practices. So you can't use the wood of a tree that was worshipped as part of idolatrous practices, right? And if you did use such a tree, then you would have violated a severe Torah prohibition. So let's say that this would not have anything to do with the holiday. So now we would have 5 transgressions back in place, and this would be an answer to Abaye that your proof that the fact that there's 5 transgressions from cooking the sciatic nerve of a cow in milk on a holiday, is not going to be a proof that we don't hold by the concept of hoil. It's just a non-proof. It doesn't address that question. Now, Rav Acha, the son of Rava, says to Abaye, well, now wait a minute. If you bring an asher, if you use the wood of an asherah to cook this fire, you would actually be guilty of not 5 but 6 transgressions. Why? Because you used the wood of an idolatrous tree and you brought an abominable thing into your domain. Those are 2 separate transgressions in the Torah. And so that would sort of make the proof or non-proof a little bit clumsy and not dispositive. So rather, it'd be better if you said the person used consecrated wood. Okay, so now this was wood that was consecrated for use in the temple. And this person, after it was consecrated to give to the temple for use in the temple, made a fire of it in his own property. So now he made use of something that was consecrated. That is prohibited. And now we have 5 prohibitions. Only one of them is technically related to the holiday. The other 4 are not related to the holiday. So we don't have this idea of 2 transgressions are combined into one when the transgressions relate to forbidden categories of labor on a holiday. In any case, what we have is now this case of cooking the sciatic nerve of a cow in milk on a holiday, resulting in 5 transgressions. And we have preserved that it results in 5 transgressions. Therefore, Abaye's challenge to Rabbah, saying that if we held by the principle of since, of hoil, there wouldn't be 5 transgressions. There would only be 4, because before the 5th one was kindling a fire that is going to be unnecessary for the holiday. But since he could say he's going to use it for something permitted, even if he doesn't, he could. Now we replace that 5th one with using consecrated wood. And so we have preserved this idea that when you cook the sciatic nerve of a cow in milk on a holiday, you're going to be guilty of 5 transgressions. And we have not disproved Rabbah's contention that the earlier sages held by the principle of hoil, since. So since is still standing. The idea that we can use this escape clause to excuse someone for liability on what would otherwise be a transgression, since there was the possibility that there would not come to be a transgression, that principle still seems to be standing. It still works. And now we return to that Mishna that we're actually discussing, right? So the Mishna that all of this debate between Rabbah and Rav Hisda on whether or not we hold by the principle of hoil was in the context of a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua on what to do when somebody is making matzah on the first day of Passover, which is a Yom Tov, right? It is a festival. The festival day that has the full stringencies of a festival day as opposed to the intermediate days of Passover. So it's permitted to cook, but otherwise it's not permitted to do other labors. And so this person is making matzah, permitted, on let's say the first day of Passover, like the Seder was the night before, now it's the daytime, and he's making matzah. He must be making it to eat on that day, right? Or it would be prohibited. But he's baking matzah. And when you're making enough bread, if you're making a big enough amount, so you have the requirement to pull challah. Challah is the portion of the dough that is set aside as a gift to the priest. The problem in our situation in the Mishnah is that the dough has become tamei, ritually impure. Therefore, the priest won't be able to eat it. What do you do with challah that is impure is you have to burn it. And that's the situation we're in today, by the way. We don't give the portion of the challah to a priest because the temple is not standing. So when a woman is baking challah, what we call challah, and it's usually about 5 pounds of flour to trigger the requirement to separate challah. So when she separates that challah, that portion for the priest, can't give it to the priest. It's like the whole world is tamei. There's nothing is tahor. So it needs to be burned. It needs to be destroyed. But if it's on the first day of the holiday, so you can't burn the challah to destroy it because that's like unnecessary cooking. But also it's a problem because it's Passover, and if you pull this dough aside and let it sit there to wait till the holiday ends until you burn it, so it's going to leaven. And now you're going to be a Jew in possession of leaven during the festival of Matzahs, and you would violate that prohibition. So that's the dilemma. What do we do with it? Rabbi Eliezer says, because you're so concerned that it's going to turn into chametz, what you have to do is bake it, right? Bake the whole matzah. And then after it's baked, when there's no more danger that it will leaven, at that point, separate the challah and leave that aside and then burn it after the first day of Passover ends. Says Rabbi Yehoshua, who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer, we can do that. We can separate challah after we've baked the bread, but it is considered wrong to do that in the first place. And the optimal, the better way, the correct way to do it is to separate the dough first. And we're not concerned that it's going to become chametz. Why? Because once you separate it for the priest, even though it's going to be burned, but it's separated for the priest as a gift to the priest, now it no longer belongs to the one who separated it. So that chametz is not found in his possession. He doesn't possess it. It's at his house, but we know that we can have chametz at our house during Passover as long as it's separated from everything else that we're eating by some kind of a barrier. And that's why we sell our chametz. We put it all in the garage. We, close it off so we make sure we're not going to come to, by mistake, eat it. But we can have chametz in our house as long as we don't own it. And this dough that you set aside for the priest, you don't own it. But the dispute was, well, wait a minute, you do own it, right? And that's Rabbi Eliezer's point. You do own it. And how do we, and under what rubric is it that the person owns it if he set it aside for the priest? Rabbi Eliezer might be saying that since the person could go to a sage and retract his vow of consecration, of putting that challah aside, and he might choose a different piece of dough, so he still does have control over it. After all, it's in his house, and that is tantamount to a kind of ownership which would trigger the liability for chametz. And it must be that Rabbi Eliezer does not hold by the principle of hoil, of since, and once it's set aside, for the priest. Once it's consecrated for the priest, it's consecrated for the priest. We don't say that since he could pull it back. At this point, he has set it aside for the priest. He has pulled the challah and consecrated for the priest. Therefore, he doesn't own it. He doesn't trigger chametz liability. And he's good to go, right? So it must be that the difference between Eliezer and Yehoshua is that Eliezer does hold by the principle of hoil, like Rabbah, and it must be that Rabbi Yehoshua doesn't hold by the principle of hoil, like Rav Hisda. But perhaps, and who is it that challenges this analysis? It's Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Idi, who comes and says, well, perhaps this is not so. We know that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua come out in a different place on how to handle that challah and what to do with it on Passover, but it might not be that the reason that they come into a different place is because Eliezer holds by hoil the principle of since, and Yehoshua doesn't hold by that. Rather, it may be that Rabbi Yehoshua agrees that we hold by the principle of since, and a person might be able to retract his vow. But the fact of the matter is, this person who separated challah in his house for the priest, and he's just going to leave it there. He's going to let it become chametz. He's going to let it become leaven, and then destroy it after the holiday ends. It might be that he could retract that, but he won't retract it because he knows that if he does retract it, then there would be chametz in his possession. and he's not going to do that. And so we don't know that Rabbi Yehoshua doesn't hold by the concept of hoil. Maybe he does. We don't have a proof from the position that he takes in this dispute. And in the end, the law is like Rabbi Eliezer. It was taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says the halacha with regard to the separation of challah from impure dough, tamei dough, during Passover is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. You bake it first and then separate the challah, so you don't have a problem. You don't have the danger of it becoming chametz, and you destroy it after the holiday ends. If you forgot to bake it after you separate it, then you rely on the opinion of Ben Betera, who says put it in cold water. That will stop it from leavening, and then you burn it after the first day of Passover has passed. Okay, that completes our discussion of Mishnah number 4. Now we're going to do Mishnahs 5 and 6, but they're both very quick, very short. So if you have questions or comments, get them into the comments now. I'm coming to your questions. Okay, Mishnah number 5, very colorful, even though it's short. It gives us a peek sort of into the matzah baking, into a matzah baking establishment, right? So, people could make their own homemade matzah, but very often, so matzah is made in some kind of a facility, right? Some kind of an enterprise of making matzah for a community. And this is so even today. While there are definitely, like Manischewitz is making, I think they're still in business, or Straits is making, matzah on a big scale, those square boxes making lots of matzah. But as we've discussed, if you're making shmura matzah, which was watched meticulously from the time the wheat was harvested in the field all the way until the matzah is baked, that none of the grain ever came into contact with any kind of water so that it might have a chance of leavening. And those matzahs are all, hand kneaded and hand shaped and, hand rolled and hand everything, and then put into the oven. And what does it look like? What we see is that that the women who are making this matzah, and here the Gemara is referring to it as women, not just bakers, and that they work in groups of 3. Why? Because this is going to be an efficient way to work and make sure that the dough doesn't have a chance to become leavened, either because it's going to all happen within 18 minutes of the dough being kneaded and then getting into the oven, or as we saw, as long as people are working with the dough, it will not leaven. In order for it to leaven, it needs to sit, right? And so as long as they're doing something with it, it won't have that chance to leaven. So how does that work? Here we go, Mishnah number 5 of chapter 3 on page 48 in Tractate Pesachim. Rabban Gamliel says, 3 women may knead their dough as one, meaning at one time, and bake the batches of dough in one oven, one after the other. And they need not be concerned that their dough will become leavened while they are waiting to use the oven. And the rabbis say 3 women may be engaged in preparing dough as one in the following manner. One kneads her dough, as another one arranges her dough so that it takes the form of the matzah, while another one bakes her dough. Excuse me. And Rabbi Akiva says, well, not all women and not all ovens are the same, right? Rather, this is the principle. If the dough begins to rise, she should spread cold water in which she immersed her hands onto the dough in order to stop the leavening process, right? So Rabbi Akiva is going to warn, well, this sounds good, right? But some women work fast, some women work slower, some ovens are very hot, some ovens are not so hot, right? So depending on conditions, we need to just make sure that the dough never has a chance to leaven. And if it does start to leaven, we need to stop it from leavening by spreading some cold water on it. How do we know if the dough has started to leaven? That's going to be the subject of the 6th Mishnah. But first, a very quick discussion of this Mishnah number 5. I'll just read you. There's only 2 Gemaras, two paragraphs of the Gemara. The sages taught in a baraisa, When the woman who kneads first completes her kneading, she arranges her dough, and another woman kneads in her place. And when the first woman finishes arranging her dough, she bakes, and another woman arranges dough in her place, and the third woman kneads her dough. And when the first woman finishes baking, she kneads the dough for her next batch, and another woman bakes in her place, and the third woman arranges her dough, and they continue in turn. As long as they are engaged in handling the dough, it will not become leaven. Right, so it's a nice little assembly line that you could sort of think, or women working around a table, right? So one is at the kneading station, the other one is at the forming station, and the third one is at the baking station, right? And then they rotate, and that's how they keep it moving. And it was taught in the Mishna that Rabbi Akiva says that not all women, and not all wood, and not all ovens are the same. It was taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Akiva said, I deliberated this matter before Rabban Gamliel, asking, may our master, meaning Rabban Gamliel, teach us if your statement, cited in the Mishnah, was said with regard to diligent women or women who are not diligent? Was it said with regard to an oven fueled by moist wood or dry wood, right? Which the moist wood would have not as hot a fire as the dry wood. Was it said with regard to a hot oven or a cold oven? And Rabban Gamliel himself said to me, to Rabbi Akiva, you have only what the sages taught, which is that this is the principle. If the dough begins to rise such that there is a concern that it may become leavened, she should spread cold water onto the dough to prevent it from becoming leavened. So it's like this is a nice kind of way to think about how we arrange the women to do the baking, and it should work, but the higher principle is the dough must not become leavened. Right? So if three are working and yet they work kind of slow because they're chatting or they're really doing a lot of dough or some conditions are not optimal, maybe the weather is cooler in some places and hotter in others, the oven is hotter, the oven is not so hot, etc. We can't just rely on the fact that a team of 3 is approved. Rather, you have to check that the dough is not becoming leavened. Right? And the halacha is dough being used to prepare matzah should not be left idle even for one moment. This is because as long as someone is handling the dough, it will not become leavened even if a great deal of time passes, as stated in the baraisa, right? So that's a different idea, that as long as someone's handling it, right? So either because they're kneading the dough or they're forming it or they're moving it, right, from the kneading and forming station into the oven, then we don't have a problem. But if it's just being left to sit, then it could leaven, and that's when we really have to be careful. Mishnah number 6, and now I'm really almost done. I'm just going to read this Mishnah. Dough at the beginning of the leavening process, si'ur, right? It's called si'ur, must be burned because it began to leaven. But one who eats it is exempt from punishment of kares because the dough had not become fully leavened, right? So if you eat leavened bread during Passover, then you're liable to kares, excision at the hands of heaven. Dough that has reached the stage of cracking must be burned because it's leavened, and one who eats it intentionally is liable to receive kares as he has intentionally eaten leavened bread during Passover, right? So you're exempt if you eat partially leavened bread because you haven't really committed the transgression that's mentioned in the Torah. But once it's cracked, right? Once the surface has cracking, that's when it's considered leaven. And if you eat that, even if you didn't bake it, right? Even if you just ate that dough, that's considered leavened bread, and now you're liable to kares. And what is considered si'ur, right? So si'ur means that it just began to leaven. Dough that has been leavened to the point that it has cracks that look like the antenna of locusts. And the stage of cracking occurs later in the leavening process when the cracks intermingle. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. And the rabbis say, one who intentionally eats this or that, dough with cracks that look like locust antennae, or with cracks that have become intermingled, is liable to receive kares, as once the dough begins to crack, it has certainly become leavened. And what is si'ur? It is any dough whose surface has become pale, like the face of a person whose hair stands on end, because of fear. Right, so they're debating when can we say from the visual appearance of the dough that it has become leavened, right? Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if it just has a few cracks that are kind of curving like the antenna of a locust, that's partially leavened. But when the cracks on the surface of the dough start to intermingle, then it's definitely leavened, and that would trigger liability for kares. But the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yehuda say it's partially leavened just when it becomes pale. Like the color changes, it becomes paler. And what kind of paleness? The paleness, I love this, of a person whose hair stands on end from fright. But if there's any cracking in the surface of the dough, then it has become leavened, and one who eats that is liable to kares. That's the Mishna. And the halacha, the law is, dough is considered to be leavened once it has begun to rise and cracks appear on its surface. A person is liable to receive kares for eating such dough on Passover, even if the cracks are not intermingled, right? Rabbi Yehuda distinguished between just a few cracks that are curved and when the cracks start to intermingle, but the law is according to the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yehuda, and as soon as there's any cracks on the surface of the dough, it's considered leavened. What is partially leavened? However, if the dough's surface has merely become pale, one is exempt for eating it. You still violated a prohibition, but you're exempt from the punishment. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis in the Mishnah rather than the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let us check comments and questions. Okay. Pam Simmons asks, with the women baking in a group of 3, is this more than just an efficient method of baking matzah? The significance of the number 3 represents stability, yes? Also, does it have any relation to Kabbalah and the 3 parts of the soul? So it's a great question, Pam. I'm not aware that there's a spiritual significance to that number. The sort of more practical suggestion would be that if you have 4 who are sort of doing, kind of operating in stations, then they might be producing more dough than can go into their oven at a time to be baked, and therefore it would have more time for the dough to leaven, right? So that seems to be the practical significance of this. I like what you're saying in terms of that number 3 is a number of stability. We have a lot of teachings like that, like the world stands on 3 things, on the worship of God, on prayer, and doing good deeds, right? On the service of God, studying Torah, and doing good deeds. That's one of the famous ones. And so it's like the world is, it's a 3-legged stool. We've seen that in the Talmud, that's a 3-legged stool, and that implies stability. And in terms of, the levels of the soul, some would say there's 4 levels of the soul. Some say there's 5. So I'm not sure that it's a Kabbalistic teaching about 3 baking together. However, you could certainly see, you might think, for example, that there's something nice about the 3 women baking together. They're going to be, sharing stories. There's like, that whole idea of sort of women handing through the generations. You could almost imagine a grandma, a mom, and a daughter baking together, and there's something very beautiful about that. However, when people are making matzah, and particularly like in a facility where they're making shmura matzah, they very much want the people not to be chatting, right, while they're doing this. They need to be completely focused on the holiness of the task, right? Because they're creating this matzah that is going to be used by Jews to fulfill their obligation on that first night when they must eat matzah, and they want it to be infused with as high a level of sanctity, as possible. And so that you can, if you Google this question, like what it's like at a shmura matzah factory, like while they're making the dough and baking, etc., there are people literally walking around all the tables where the people are baking and reminding them that they are doing something that is awash in sanctity, and that they should keep their focus on what they're doing. it's a nice lesson to all of us who maybe aren't going to find ourselves, baking matzah in a factory. But, for example, when we're praying, especially if we pray every day, 3 times a day, it's so easy to, just repeat the words by rote, and it becomes meaningless to us, and we're even like running a shopping list through our heads of what we're going to do later when we should be focused on the davening, on the praying. And it would be nice to kind of like, embrace that same kind of mindset as the women who are baking matzah and are going to really focus and keep their head in the game, that what they're doing is a very, very holy practice, and they want to be focused on what they're doing to even enhance its holiness that much more. And same idea for women making challah, for Shabbos, and same idea for men wrapping tefillin every day. When we're engaged in the mitzvah, we want to be focused on the mitzvah if at all possible. I know that I'm, as guilty as anyone of letting my mind wander, but it's something to work on, and it's a good reminder to do that as we're being reminded today. Okay, just want to check and make sure there's nothing else. I don't believe there is. So beautiful. That's what I've got for us today, my pals. You should have such a sweet Shabbos. We really need a Shabbos of peace, of tranquility, of reset, as Yehudit Soba likes to say. That this should be a rejuvenating Shabbos and a reset for our souls. And that's what Shabbos is really all about. Just as God stopped working and stopped creating and said, it's good, so should we stop, pause, be able to look at our lives, and even if our lives are really difficult and challenging, we should be able to identify what is good in our lives and what we're grateful for, at the very minimum, that we're alive. And as long as there's life, there's hope. Have a great